This is the Robert Joodat Podcast. Refined conversations on love, attraction, and becoming your best self. Stay curious.
That feeling you got when something was off, before you had a single piece of evidence, before anyone said a word and you were right? Science is finally catching up to that moment. Today, we're unpacking female intuition through three lenses. What's actually happening in the brain, what evolutionary psychology says about why it exists, and what the lived experience research tells us that the lab can't fully capture. By the end of this episode, you'll know what intuition actually is at a neurological level, why it may have been shaped differently across genders, and here's the part that surprised me, why it's not a fixed trait, but something you can actually build. My co-host has been deep in the research on this, so let's get into it.
So the first thing worth saying is that intuition has a real scientific definition, and it's not what most people think. A 2008 study in the British Journal of Psychology defined intuition as what happens when the brain draws on past experiences and external cues to make a decision, but it happens so fast that the reaction is at an unconscious level.
So it's not random, it's not mystical, it's the brain processing at a speed we can't consciously track.
Exactly. And that framing matters a lot because for a long time, and a 2025 systematic review published in Frontiers actually calls this out directly, the notion of female intuition has been, quote, marginalized or misconstrued. The review by Roberto Gomez Tobias at Tecnológico de Monterrey frames it instead as a nuanced form of embodied judgment.
Embodied judgment. What does that actually mean? Because that phrase could mean a lot of things.
Right, so embodied here means it's not just happening in your head, it's happening in your body too. And that connects to a concept called attunement, which is the focus of a 2025 paper in Frontiers by Shalini Verma and Lucy Kind. They define attunement as the ability to somatically, emotionally, and cognitively resonate with the internal states of oneself or another.
So it's like tuning into a frequency that someone else is broadcasting, but you're doing it with your whole body, not just your mind.
That's actually a really good way to put it. And Verma and Kind argue that this capacity is especially important in caregiving, safety detection, and emotion regulation. It's not soft, it's functional.
Okay, so let's get into the brain side of this. Because I think a lot of people have heard things about women's brains being wired differently, and it's hard to know what's real versus what's just a talking point.
Yeah, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting and a little complicated. So, according to Dr. Judith Orloff, writing in Psychology Today, scientists believe intuition operates through the right side of the brain, the hippocampus, and also through the gut. And she points out that a woman's corpus callosum, that's the connective white matter that links the left and right brain hemispheres, is thicker than a man's.
Wait, the gut? Like literally the digestive system?
Literally, the digestive system has neurons. There are neurotransmitters in the gut that can respond to environmental stimuli and emotions in the present moment. So when you feel butterflies or that unease in your stomach, that's a real neurological event, not just a metaphor. Orloff describes it as gut instinct sending signals to your brain.
That's wild. So the gut is actually part of the intuition circuit.
It appears to be, yeah. And going back to the corpus callosum, because that's the structural piece, Orloff explains that a thicker corpus callosum gives women better and faster access to both hemispheres, so they can integrate emotional gut feelings with the more logical decision-making functions of the left hemisphere more fluidly.
So the idea is that women's brains are literally more cross-wired for this kind of rapid, integrative thinking.
That's how Orloff frames it. She says women's brains are optimized for rapid, intuitive decision-making. But here's where I want to pump the brakes a little, because there's a real tension in the research.
Oh, interesting. What's the tension?
So a 2022 study published in Neuroimage by Julia Rauch and Lise Elliott at Rosalind Franklin University reviewed decades of brain imaging research and concluded that, despite all that pursuit, human brain imaging has yet to uncover clear neural correlates of male-female behavioral differences.
So we've been scanning brains for decades, and we still can't definitively point to the thing that makes women more intuitive?
Not definitively, no. And Rauch and Elliott actually argue that behavior doesn't always align neatly with biological sex categories. They suggest neuroimaging research might find more success by looking at gender as a multidimensional variable, not just a binary.
So the science is saying the brain differences might be real, but they're more complex and more socially shaped than a simple male-female split.
Exactly. And that actually sets up the evolutionary psychology piece really well, because that's where the nature-nurture interplay gets really rich.
Okay, let's go there. What does evolutionary psychology actually say about why women might have developed stronger intuitive capacities?
So the core argument laid out by Julian Hartman in a 2025 analysis is that women's intuition developed as an adaptive trait for social bonding and survival. The idea is that over evolutionary time, women needed to read social environments quickly, to detect threats, to maintain group cohesion, to care for children who couldn't communicate verbally.
So it's not just a nice to have, it was a survival mechanism.
That's the argument. And Verma and Kind in their Frontiers paper put it this way. Biologically, women bear the primary responsibility for carrying a child to term. That creates an evolutionary pressure toward attunement, toward being able to read the internal states of another being who literally cannot tell you what they need.
That's a really concrete way to think about it. The mother-infant relationship as the original training ground for attunement.
And Verma and Kind actually cite research showing that in the mother-child relationship specifically, attunement functions as the primary form of intuition. It's not a side feature, it's the main event.
But here's what I want to push on, because this is where it gets a little tricky. How much of what we call female intuition is biology, and how much is just what we've been trained to do?
That's the central question, and the honest answer from the research is both, and they're hard to separate. Verma and Kind describe it as a complex interplay of biological and sociocultural factors. And Orloff makes a really pointed observation. Girls are often praised for being sensitive, while boys are urged to be more linear in their thinking rather than listening to their feelings.
So we're literally socializing boys out of intuition from a young age.
That's what the research suggests. And Orloff's conclusion is striking. She says it appears that women have more intuition than men, but part of the reality is that women are encouraged to be receptive to their inner thoughts in a way men often aren't.
Which means the gap might be as much about permission as it is about biology.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the most important points in the Verma and Kind paper. They stress that attunement is innate to all humans, not just women. Men can develop it too. The capacity is there, it's the cultivation that differs.
Okay, so this is the part that genuinely surprised me when I read the research, because I went in thinking this was going to be a story about a fixed biological trait, and it's actually a story about a skill.
Right, and that's the most important reframe. Verma and Kind are very explicit. Attunement is not static. It can be dulled or distorted by traumatic experience, and it can be reclaimed through healing. They argue that through the restoration of nervous system balance, people, especially trauma survivors, can regain access to deeper, more accurate intuitive information.
So trauma actually disrupts intuition. That's a connection I hadn't made before.
It's a significant one. And there's a real-world example of this in a 2025 Frontiers study on South Asian women navigating divorce. The researchers found that women who were rebuilding their identities after divorce were turning to what the study calls intuitive healing practices, journaling, yoga, chanting, as part of that reconstruction. Not as passive coping, but as active reclamation of bodily sovereignty and emotional toughness.
So they were literally rebuilding their attunement capacity through these practices.
That's how the researchers frame it. And it connects to what Verma and Kind call intuition as a reparative skill, something you can lose access to and find your way back to.
I want to go back to the leadership angle for a second, because the Frontiers review by Gomez-Tobias makes a really interesting argument about where this shows up professionally.
Yeah, so that review, which looked at peer-reviewed literature from 2000 to 2024 across multiple major databases, specifically examines how female intuition influences innovation, risk perception, and decision quality in economic and leadership contexts. And the core argument is that this capacity has been systematically undervalued.
Undervalued how? Like dismissed as not rigorous?
Exactly that. Gomez-Tobias describes it as an epistemic bias, the idea that intuitive cognition, especially when associated with women, gets treated as less legitimate than analytical reasoning. But the review argues that recognizing cognitive diversity, including intuitive judgment, is actually a strategic asset for organizations and economic policy.
So it's not just a personal capacity. It has real implications for how we structure workplaces and leadership.
That's the argument. And the review calls for gender-sensitive educational practices and economic policies that take this seriously. It's a pretty bold claim that dismissing female intuition isn't just culturally unfair, it's economically costly.
Okay, I want to steelman the skeptic here for a second, because someone listening might say, look, this all sounds great, but isn't there a risk that framing intuition as a female trait just reinforces stereotypes? Like, women are emotional, men are logical?
That's a really fair challenge, and the research actually addresses it directly. Verma and Kind are careful to say that attunement is not exclusively female. It's a human capacity that women have been more likely to develop and trust due to evolutionary and social pressures. The goal isn't to essentialize women as intuitive beings. It's to stop dismissing a form of intelligence that happens to be more cultivated in women.
So the argument is, stop calling it a soft skill, start calling it what it is, a sophisticated cognitive tool.
And one that's grounded in the body, in relationships, and in evolutionary history. That's the full picture.
Let's talk about what this looks like in practice. Because I think the research is compelling, but what does it actually mean to develop or trust your attunement?
So Orloff's practical guidance is to start by paying attention to your physical responses. Because remember, intuition is partly a body event. The gut neurotransmitters, the physical sensations. She describes intuition as an unflinching truth teller committed to your well-being. The first step is just learning to notice when your body is sending a signal.
Which is harder than it sounds, especially if you've been trained to override those signals.
Much harder. And that's where the trauma piece comes back in, because Verma and Kind argue that trauma specifically disrupts the nervous system's ability to track arousal and interpret subtle cues. So for people who've experienced trauma, rebuilding intuition might actually require rebuilding nervous system regulation first.
That reframes a lot of things, like the reason some people feel disconnected from their gut feelings might not be a personality trait, it might be a trauma response.
That's exactly what the research suggests. And it's a much more compassionate framing than just telling someone to trust their gut.
Okay, I also want to circle back to the brain imaging question because I think it's important not to leave that hanging. The Rauch and Elliott study is saying we haven't found the neural correlates. Does that mean the brain differences aren't real, or just that we haven't found them yet? It's more the latter, with an important caveat. Rauch and Elliott aren't saying there are no differences, they're saying the differences we've found are critically sensitive to methodology. And they're arguing that treating gender as a multidimensional variable, rather than a binary, might actually reveal more. So the science is still evolving.
Which is kind of the honest answer, right? We know something real is happening, we just don't have the full map yet.
And that's actually a more interesting story than a clean answer would be, because it means the conversation between biology, socialization, and lived experience is still open. The research isn't settled, it's alive. I love that framing. The science is alive. Okay, let's start pulling this together, because we've covered a lot of ground. The neuroscience, the evolutionary argument, the socialization piece, the trauma connection. What's the through line?
So here's what I think the through line is. Female intuition is not a myth, and it's not a superpower. It's a real cognitive and somatic capacity, what Verma and Kind call attunement, that has been shaped by evolutionary pressures, reinforced by socialization, and systematically undervalued in professional and intellectual discourse.
And the most surprising thing is that it's not fixed.
That's the part that changes everything. It's learnable, it's repairable, and it's not exclusively female. It's a human skill that we've collectively decided to cultivate more in some people than others. The question is what we do with that knowledge.
So when you step back from all of this, the brain anatomy, the evolutionary biology, the socialization research, what's the real-world implication for someone listening right now?
I think it's this. The gut feelings you've been told to second guess, the hunches you've been trained to dismiss as unscientific, they have a biological and evolutionary foundation. They're not noise, they're signal. And the research from Verma and Kind, from Gomez-Tobias, from Orloff, it all points to the same conclusion. Taking intuition seriously, developing it, and creating space for it in leadership and decision-making isn't soft, it's strategic.
And for anyone who feels disconnected from that signal, maybe because of stress or trauma or just years of being told to be more rational, the research is saying that's not permanent.
Right. Verma and Kind are very clear. Attunement can be reclaimed. The nervous system can be rebalanced. The capacity is there. It's about creating the conditions to access it again.
There's something almost radical about that. The idea that what we've been calling a feminine quirk is actually a trainable, repairable, strategically valuable form of intelligence.
And one that the Frontiers Review argues we should be building into educational practices and economic policy. This isn't just a personal development conversation, it has structural implications.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We started this episode with that moment, the feeling you had before you had any evidence. And what the science is telling us is that moment wasn't irrational. It was your brain and your body running a very fast, very sophisticated process that we're only beginning to fully understand.
And the fact that we've spent so long dismissing it, in boardrooms, in research labs, in everyday conversations, says more about our cultural biases than it does about the validity of the capacity itself.
So the next time someone tells you that your gut feeling isn't evidence, you can tell them the British Journal of Psychology, Frontiers, and Psychology Today all disagree.
And that the gut literally has its own neurons. So technically, it is evidence.
That's the closer right there. That feeling you were told to ignore, turns out it has neurons. Thanks for being here for this one. It's been a genuinely fascinating conversation.
Thank you for listening to Robert Joodat Podcast. Subscribe to be notified of the upcoming episodes. Available on Spotify and all other major platforms.